Rain had drifted over the prairie that evening in April 1986, leaving the streets around St. Matthew's slick and mirror-dark. The stained glass windows of the church still glowed faintly from the vestry lamps as the last of the choir lingered, packing sheets of music into cracked leather folders, tugging on coats, whispering weekend plans. Anna Mitchell, 24, stood by the side door with her hymnal pressed to her ribs, her hair a loose chestnut halo damp from the mist, her voice still humming the alto line of "Abide with Me." She told Jean, the soprano who always worried too much, that she would lock up the side sacristy because Father Doyle had asked. She smiled, that small, familiar smile that softened strangers and left friends relieved. She stepped out into the night, cut around the rectory garden, and vanished somewhere between the service's last echo and the rattle of keys in a lock. Her blue Oldsmobile rested behind the rectory, beaded with droplets as if the car had sat in quiet prayer. The driver's seat held a single wool scarf, folded. On the passenger seat lay her hymnal, open to a page marked with a brittle yellow ribbon. The church doors were found locked from the inside. No footprints trailed across the soggy grass except the muddled tracks of parishioners who had already gone home. The narrow alley behind the rectory smelled of damp brick and cold lilac. Every detail felt ordinary, which made the absence feel monstrous. By morning, the quiet Illinois town had gathered in clumps along the sidewalk, arms folded against the chill, faces pinched with the kind of dread that settled low in the stomach. Sheriff's deputies walked the grounds with flashlights even in daylight, running beams along hedges, lifting lids of trash cans, rapping on the warped boards of the basement bulkhead. St. Matthew's rang with the hollow sound of worry, pews creaked, doors sighed, the rectory phone jangled itself hoarse. When Father Raymond Doyle raised his hand at the vigil and asked for calm, his voice filled the nave the way it did every Sunday, measured, steady, steeped in the timbre of routine comfort. He spoke about faith in darkness and the discipline of charity. People nodded, grateful for instructions on how to carry grief. No one knew what to do with terror. The town held on to fragments. A busboy from O'Malley swore he saw a pale shape cross the churchyard at 9:15. The dry cleaner's wife said she heard a car door close twice. A delivery driver remembered a man in a tan coat smoking beneath the elm at the corner, though later he could not recall the man's face. Anna's parents sat at their kitchen table with mugs of tea growing cold, looking at the telephone as though it might finally confess. Her mother ran a thumb over a snapshot of Anna singing on the church steps the previous Christmas, snow stuck like sugar to her hair. Her father polished his glasses with the same square of cloth until it shredded. Searches began and failed. They combed drainage ditches and creek edges, the abandoned canning factory, the equipment shed at the Little League field. Volunteers returned home with burrs stuck to their socks and stories of odd silences. The case gathered dust in the county archive under a title written lightly in pencil, as if the hand that wrote it hesitated to press. Mitchell, Anna, missing persons. Parishioners kept whispering through the years that followed, trading versions that rounded edges to fit their fear. Everyone agreed on one unspoken rule: suspicion did not climb the steps to the pulpit. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town, her car found parked behind the rectory, her hymnal book still on the passenger seat, and the church doors locked from inside. For decades, her case remained one of the state's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Parishioners whispered, but not about the man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years. That man, Father Raymond Doyle, attended every search, held hands at every prayer circle, and learned the names of the dogs that sniffed the tall grass for whatever nobody could bear to name. Time performed its ordinary magic trick, lengthening distances while tightening them, softening memory while burnishing myth. By the time the first renovation crew arrived at St. Matthew's in 2023, most of the original plaster had split along hairline cracks, the basement's air smelled like old water and candle smoke, and the congregation had thinned to gray heads and young families who did not know the story except as a cautionary hush. The crew stacked ladders under the hammer-beam ceiling and tapped at loose brick along the basement wall near a built-over coal chute. On the third day, a mason's chisel struck something that did not sound like brick. The echo carried a wooden hollowness, as if the wall answered with a swallowed voice. Behind a layer of patched brickwork, the workers uncovered a small compartment, neatly sealed in mortar that had aged a shade warmer than the rest. Inside lay a rosary with its silver cross tarnished to pewter, a compact mirror spotted like a quail's egg, a crushed matchbook from a highway diner 30 miles north, and a torn page from a hymnal. The corner held a name in tidy blue ink, A. Mitchell. The page bore a verse underlined faintly in pencil, the graphite darkened by the rub of time. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. The county lab did not look like the forensics shows, but it carried that sacred quiet of rooms where answers were coaxed. The torn page and the rosary chain went to a state facility 2 counties over. The compact went into a clear envelope, catalogued twice. Modern forensic testing rose to its choreography, collection, extraction, amplification, routines that did not exist in 1986. When the analyst's report came back, the sheriff read it once, then again, the words shifting from improbable to undeniable. The profile extracted from biological traces on the chain and the hymnal page matched a known sample taken years earlier during a parish-wide drive to create a DNA registry for disaster response. The name attached to the match belonged to a man who had lived for decades under a halo of trust. Modern forensic testing revealed traces of DNA linking the evidence to Father Raymond Doyle, a now retired priest who had moved to a nearby town. The discovery shattered a community built on faith and trust, and exposed the darkness that had hidden beneath the altar for nearly 4 decades. When deputies drove out to the bungalow where Father Doyle lived his retirement, they found the yard precise as a memory. The hedges were clipped into obedient lines, a bluebird feeder hung from a shepherd's hook, and the porch held a cane propped as carefully as a sermon note. Doyle opened the door before they knocked. Age had thinned him but did not diminish the carriage that years' investments had taught his spine. He invited them in with a host's reflex, offered coffee, asked after families whose grandchildren he had baptized. When they read him the rites he had read to others in a different spiritual register, his mouth collapsed into a careful line. He did not ask why. He asked who found it. News traveled as it always did, faster than it ought, tangled with stories that grew antlers at every retelling. At St. Matthew's, 3 generations of parishioners showed up before sunrise the next day and sat in the pews without lights, the nave a grey bowl of breath and grief. Old Mrs. Reinhold wept into a hanky and said the word betrayed so softly it sounded like a prayer. Others stared at the stained glass and tried to reconcile hands that had lifted a chalice with hands that had touched the inside of a sealed compartment. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell had disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town, leaving behind her car, her hymnal on the passenger seat, and a mystery sealed by locked doors. Now the story's spine had bent. The man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years, who had blessed children at Easter and whispered absolutions into old ears, stood at the center of a truth that burned. I first read the case file in a stale county records room where dust rose like gnats in the light. I had come to the town on a different assignment and asked idly for the folder because people in the diner kept putting their hands to their hearts when they said her name. Anna Mitchell. They remembered her laugh more than her face. They remembered the way she stood at the end of the third pew with her parents on Christmas Eve. They remembered that she kept pencils in a mason jar by the phone. They remembered that she ran the back staircase 2 steps at a time when she was late. They remembered everything except the part where she went from living to legend. I read the first deputy's report about the car behind the rectory, the hymnal open like a palm, the church doors locked from inside. I read the map of the original searches, the circles drawn in red pencil, the annotations, pond too deep, dog alert inconclusive, door locked from within, how? I walked the grounds the way they did that first week. The rectory's back path still held its slight tilt. The alley still caught the wind like a throat catches sorrow. The basement bulkhead door had been replaced, but the concrete remembered the weight of whoever had gone down there that night. The older parishioners watched me walk and did not say much. When the discovery came in 2023, the same faces appeared again, older and smaller inside their coats. The first interview I did after the DNA report belonged to a woman named Jean, the soprano who had fretted over keys and locks that night in April 1986. She kept the choir robes and garment bags in her spare room, unable to throw them out when the church replaced them. She served me tea in a cup that had lost its handle and set a fragile sugar bowl between us as if some part of this story could be sweetened. Anna always stayed to help, she said. Even when she was tired. She said the church felt different when it was empty. Like you could hear something truer when the building wasn't trying to be useful. Jean blinked slowly. He told us he'd been in the rectory office all night finishing homily notes. He said he locked the side door because he'd found it ajar. I believed him because I wanted to. Who wouldn't? I met Anna's parents in a living room where nothing had been moved in years except dust and time. Her mother, Lorraine, wore the bracelet Anna had given her on Mother's Day in 1985, a chain of small silver ovals that clicked as she fidgeted. Her father, Walter, held a dog-eared binder of photocopied clippings. He did not use the new report's name. He said, "the priest," and left a foot of air between the words. They showed me a letter Anna had written to a cousin the week before she vanished, about needing to talk to Father Doyle about a difficult piece of music. She had underlined difficult twice, which Lorraine interpreted as worry and Walter as passion. Between them on the coffee table sat a small ceramic angel with one wing glued back on. The sheriff, a different man than the one who paced the churchyard in 1986, told me the basement compartment had been made with care and planning. This wasn't some haphazard hidey hole, he said. The mortar matched what the church used in the 50s. Somebody knew materials. Somebody had time. Somebody had the keys. He let the last word hang. Keys. The town had always been proud of how St. Matthew's had never once needed to change the locks. I read transcripts of interviews from the old case. They painted a map of proximity, who had access to the church after hours, who had been seen where. Arrows pointed to the rectory, to the choir loft, to the basement kitchen where coffee urns clanked on Sundays. In one margin, a young deputy had written of Father Doyle, faultless. Next to it, another hand wrote, perhaps later, given access to all spaces. Even then the fact hid in plain ink, a quiet admission that the person most trusted had also been the person most free to move. When deputies questioned Doyle in his bungalow, he spoke in the half-answers of a man practicing humility. He said he touched everything at St. Matthew's. He said he picked up mislaid rosaries and straightened hymnals and wiped wax from candle holders. He said that if his DNA lived on those objects, that was proof of pastoral care, not guilt. He said he had watched 3 generations sing lead kindly light and had loved them all for how earnestly they wanted to be guided. He said he had locked the doors that night because the wind picked up and rattled them. He said he had gone to bed by 11. He said he woke at 3 and prayed for the sake of a nameless worry, which he now understood had been the spirit warning him. He said many things that sounded true because he had always sounded true. He did not explain the sealed compartment in the basement wall. He said he had never known it existed. He asked for his lawyer. St. Matthew's basement told a different story. The compartment sat behind a shelving unit where the altar society kept polish and aprons, a modest space the size of a bread box, concealed behind a skin of brick troweled smooth. The objects inside felt simultaneously random and chosen. The compact mirror showed a woman's face in small, shattered moons. The matchbook came from a diner at an exit where young couples sometimes drove late at night to escape the expectations of old houses. The rosary had been held often enough to soften the beads' edges. The torn hymnal page, with A. Mitchell in the corner, felt like a finger tapping the shoulder of time. I stood in that basement one afternoon, the smell of plastered dust still sharp, and listened for what the room wanted to confess. Footsteps creaked overhead where children practiced for First Communion. The furnace coughed. A fly rattled in a window well. I traced my hand along the mortar line where the compartment had been. Whoever sealed it had been careful with the trowel, smoothing the excess, feathering the edges to blend with the original wall. Not an amateur's panic. A craftsman's attention. Or a pastor's habit of hiding roughness under liturgy. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell had vanished between the glow of evening service and the click of a lock, her car found behind the rectory, her hymnal open on the passenger seat, and the doors locked from inside. For decades, her disappearance remained among Illinois' most haunting mysteries, molded by whispers that skirted the pulpit. In 2023, a sealed compartment in the church basement broke the town's practiced silence, and modern forensic testing linked what lay inside to Father Raymond Doyle, the long-trusted priest now retired to a quiet street a town away. The discovery tore a seam in a community stitched by faith and habit, exposing darkness that had settled beneath the altar for nearly 40 years. That darkness did not roar. It murmured in familiar tones, disguised as care, disguised as stewardship, disguised as the comfort of routine. I found the old janitor, Mr. Cowell, in a nursing home that smelled like talc and disinfectant and oranges. He had kept St. Matthew's floors waxed to a schoolhouse shine in the 70s and 80s. His hands trembled when he lifted his styrofoam cup, but his eyes still carried the blue of a hard winter sky. He told me about a week in early 1986 when they had bricked over the old coal chute to make room for a new storage shelf. "We didn't have the money to replace the chute hatch," he said. "Father said the basement was damp anyway, better to seal it." He tapped the armrest. He watched the brickwork. Said his father had been a mason, knew the trade. "Funny how you remember what isn't important." He closed his eyes a moment. Anna sang like a bell. He did not remember the exact day they finished the wall. He did remember who held the trowel last. Evening descended on the town in the slow, resigned way it always had. Porch lights clicked on across the block. At St. Matthew's, the organist practiced alone, working the last notes of a hymn until they settled into place like a bird into a nest. I walked the aisle and paused where shadows pooled near the altar rail. Marble could be a kind of book if you learned to read it, scratches, stains, places where a heel turned too often. Under the pulpit, the air felt cooler, a quick breath of cellar. I imagined the night in April 1986 when the last choir voice faded and the church exhaled. I imagined Anna's footfalls tapping a rhythm as she rounded the rectory. I imagined the click of the door, the soft cluck of tongue against palate a person made when they found themselves unexpectedly alone. I imagined a second set of footsteps matching hers, familiar enough not to startle. The sheriff's office reopened the file with a fresh cover and a different color tab. They sent a team to the diner 30 miles north, though the matchbook chain had closed in the 90s. They tracked down choir members scattered to other towns, other states. They measured the distances between rooms inside the church, the sounds a door made when closed softly versus fast. They tested keys against locks replaced in the late 2000s, charted what was original and what had been remade. They requested old homily drafts from the diocesan archive, not for theology but for handwriting, for small marginal notes that might echo pencil lines under a hymn. They found a receipt for mortar and brick in the parish ledger, purchased on a Friday 3 weeks before Anna vanished, initialed by RD with a loop that could have been anyone's. In the bungalow, Doyle's lawyer advised silence. Parishioners drove by slowly, then more quickly, unwilling to be seen but unable to resist the orbit of the known address. A vase of lilies appeared on the steps and vanished by dusk. Reporters arrived like crows and drifted away, leaving a residue of headlines that used words like shocked and betrayal. The diocese issued statements written in the pale language of institutions that had learned to be careful. No one wrote the word guilty. Everyone said facts. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell had disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town, leaving behind her car, her hymnal on the passenger seat, and a mystery locked inside a familiar building. In 2023, a renovation crew had opened a mouth in the basement wall, and what spilled out had pointed, with the indifferent arithmetic of DNA, to Father Raymond Doyle. At night I listened to the cassette a local hobbyist had made of the choir that spring, transferred from a wobbly tape to an MP3. You could hear the church breathe between verses, the shuffle of shoes, a muffled cough, the swirl of skirts settling. Anna's alto carried a clarity that did not need to insist. She sounded like someone who knew exactly which line belonged to her and how to keep it. I rewound the track where they sang Lead, Kindly Light, the same hymn Page found torn in the basement. In the recording, the word light lifted just a fraction, the way a hand rises above a crowd before it drops. I pressed my fingers to the earbuds like I could touch the moment that had buckled a life. A man named Abbott, who had run the hardware store for 40 years, showed me a plasterer's trowel he said Father Doyle had borrowed and never returned. It hung on a hook in his back office, cleaned but stained at the hinge, the metal worn to a dark shine from a careful hand. He brought it back the week after we bricked the chute, Abbott said. Told me to keep it on hand for the church next time, so I labeled the hook. He pointed to a yellowed strip of masking tape that read St. Matt's trowel. He laughed in a way that did not sound like laughter. Next time. Storms moved through that spring of 2023, bending the elms along the street and washing pollen into bright green clots at the curb. The town lived in a posture of flinch, waiting for whatever came next to land. In the second week of the reopened investigation, a carpenter from the original renovation crew came forward with a detail that had bothered him and, like so many bothersome details, had hid itself under the bustle of work. He said that while knocking loose brick near the compartment, he had found a thin metal key wedged sideways under a joist, too old and narrow for modern locks, too clean to have been there since the church's earliest days. He had slipped it into his pocket, meaning to turn it in, then forgotten, then remembered, then felt silly. He placed it on the sheriff's desk wrapped in a napkin. The key fit no current lock at St. Matthew's. It did, however, match the antique cabinet in the sacristy that the Altar Society had replaced in 1987, a year after Anna vanished. When I told Lorraine about the key, she closed her eyes and said a prayer I did not recognize. I used to imagine doors, she said. Not what was behind them. Just doors. Some of them locked, some of them swinging open whenever I reached out. I imagined her on the other side of one, humming because she did that when she was anxious. And in the dream I never touched the knob. I just stood there listening to her hum and thinking, if I don't open it, she is still there. If I open it and she isn't, I have to learn how to live inside that emptiness. She opened her eyes. I am tired of doors. The question of how returned the way it always had. How had the church doors been locked from the inside if Anna had left? How had she been coaxed or carried into a space no one searched hard enough? How had a compartment been sealed so neatly without someone noticing mortar dust on a cuff, grit under a nail, a new seam in an old wall? How had long protected who? How had been the lullaby the town sang to itself to sleep? The choir gathered one evening at the request of the new pastor, a young man with a face unmarked by the decades that had made everyone else sharper at the edges. They stood in a crescent near the altar and sang the hymns that had lined their lives. Jean the soprano, her voice wobbled but brave, took the starting note. The basses joined a half beat late, as always. I watched their mouths shape words like light and guide and home. The church acoustics carried their voices up into the rafters, where they seemed to tangle in the beams like ribbons caught in a high branch. I thought of Anna, of the way she had held her part when everyone else slid sharp or flat, steady as a metronome in the chest. I thought of the name written on that torn page, and of a priest's hand setting a trowel into mortar. I thought of a key dropped by accident or hidden on purpose, of locks that kept in and locks that kept out, of doors that closed softly, expertly, with a pastor's touch. After the rehearsal, Jean told me that in the weeks before Anna vanished, she had noticed more private conferences between Anna and Father Doyle in the side chapel, the kind of quick, intense conversations people mistake for counsel. She always came out with color in her cheeks, Jean said. Sometimes angry, sometimes, no, not happy. Resolved. Jean rubbed a thumb over her palm. I told myself he was helping her through something. He was our confessor. What we didn't confess was how much we liked the relief of giving him our hard parts. In a file at the diocesan office, I found a memo from 1985 about pastoral counseling boundaries, a quiet sign of an institution trying to learn itself out of old habits. It bore signatures from multiple priests in the region. Doyle's name sat among them, signed in a hand taught by calligraphy and sermons. He had acknowledged the rules in ink, nodded toward the rails he was meant to hold. Rules always look cleanest on paper. The town's children, grown now, began to tell me small memories they had never told because the memories felt like lint, not evidence. A boy remembered Doyle's car parked near the side entrance after choir on Wednesdays, later than seemed necessary. A girl remembered the smell of fresh mortar in the basement the spring before Anna vanished and the way Doyle had told them not to run down there because the floor was not safe. A deacon remembered a Sunday when Doyle's homily turned on the theme of secrecy and the weight it placed on the soul, a homily that made the deacon feel both seen and scolded without knowing why. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. Her car sat behind the rectory, her hymnal lay on the passenger seat, and the church doors were locked from inside. For decades, the case haunted the state, whispered through kitchens and pews, muffled by trust. Then, in 2023, a renovation uncovered a sealed compartment in the basement wall, holding a rosary, a compact, a matchbook from a diner north of town, and a torn page of a hymn marked A. Mitchell. Modern forensic testing linked traces of DNA on those objects to Father Raymond Doyle, now retired in a nearby town, a man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years. The discovery collapsed the architecture of certainty the town had built for itself, revealing a darkness that had lain under the altar the way a root lies under grass, quiet, patient, shaping what grows above. One afternoon, I sat with Walter on his porch while thunderstorms gathered like bruises beyond the cornfields. He held Anna's hymnal in his lap, the one from her car, returned to the family after the state finished its tests. He turned the pages with a tenderness that made me look away. She always folded the corners, he said, even when I told her not to. Said the songs didn't mind a little wear. He paused on lead, kindly light. The corner was not folded but torn, the twin to the page discovered in the wall. He traced the missing wedge with his fingertip, as if soothing the absence. I believed in him, he said, not looking up. I believed in the man who told me my daughter was with God. I believed him when he said God held her. Now I don't know whose hands I picture when I try to imagine that. Lightning flared, then waited, then the thunder arrived, wide and slow, as if crossing a long room to take a seat. The storm broke open and made the streets smell briefly of metal. Across town, the lights in St. Matthew's flickered and steadied. In the bungalow, Doyle sat in a chair by his window, his cane within easy reach, a book on his lap he did not read. On his mantel stood a photograph of a young priest smiling too broadly, a smile that, once seen in this new light, looked like a man straining to keep a mask balanced. The sheriff told me they had found more, not smoking guns, those rarely existed in stories that lived this long, but additional threads, each thin, together a rope. An old invoice for a locksmith hired after a vestry key went missing in 1986, the note initialed by Doyle. A ledger entry for a donation to the diner's church fund that matched the date on the matchbook stamped calendar square. A choir attendance sheet with a smudged thumbprint in the margin that matched Anna's index finger. None of it sang alone. Together it hummed a low and terrible chord. I returned to the basement, to the line in the wall where the compartment had been, and thought of sealing and unsealing, of the theology of hidden things. I pressed my palm to the cool brick and tried, absurdly, to feel a pulse. Upstairs, the choir tumbled into laughter after someone's wrong note, the sound so human and easy that it felt like a mercy. In the hush that followed, I could hear another sound, the small tick of water in the pipes, the building's old bones shifting, and something else I could not name, the audible shape of a story about to speak the part it had swallowed for years. And then, in a stack of donation envelopes backdated to 1986, someone found a fragment that had slid under the ledger's backboard and lain invisible for decades, the corner of a page in a different handwriting, not Anna's tidy blue ink but a darker, heavier hand that pressed hard enough to bruise paper. It contained 2 words, incomplete at the tear. They read, "Side do," and stopped. The stroke of the R was cut away by the rip. I held it in my palm and thought of the side door, the way it clicked, the way it could be locked gently so that anyone, standing outside, would think it had been locked for hours. I took the fragment to Lorraine and Walter, not because it promised resolution but because it felt like something that had belonged to their house all along. Lorraine held it up to the window and squinted as if the light could reattach the missing letters. Side door, she said. He always told us he found the side door ajar. He said he locked it himself because of the wind. Her hand shook. He said the wind. The choir practiced that night with the doors open to the humid dark, a small act of defiance against years of closed things. The young pastor stood in the side chapel and prayed without words. Jean cried during Lead, Kindly Light, and laughed at herself for crying, and cried again. I sat in the second pew and wrote until my wrist ached, capturing sentences that had waited years to arrive. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. She left behind her car, her hymnal, and doors that seemed to keep secrets for someone. For decades, her case haunted the state, careful tongues never pointing at the pulpit. In 2023, a sealed compartment cracked open a harder truth, and modern forensic testing called a name that had once meant comfort, Father Raymond Doyle. The town held the name in its mouth like a coin and tasted iron. Late that night, thunderheads dissolved into a sky salted with stars, and St. Matthew's breathed a different air, emptier and, somehow, cleaner, as if speaking the worst thing had chased some of the rot from the beams. The floorboards creaked once, then quieted, as though the building had shifted and found a more honest way to carry its weight. I got up from the pew and walked the center aisle and stopped at the altar rail. I touched the smooth wood where hundreds of hands had rested, where Anna's had rested the last time anyone could swear to seeing her. The rail had been polished so often that it reflected a crescent of my face, distorted at the edges. I thought of mirrors and matchbooks, of keys and choirs, of a page torn and saved and hidden. I thought of a priest's hand pressing mortar into a seam, of a young woman's handwriting marking a hymn about light. I thought of how long a town could practice the habit of not seeing. I heard it then, footsteps on the old stair to the basement, measured and sure, a cadence I had come to recognize by how the building answered each step. The door eased open on its stubborn hinges, and a figure paused in the threshold with a flashlight hooded in one palm. The beam slid to the floor, then to the wall where the compartment had been, then up to the pipe that ran like a rib along the ceiling. The figure breathed out once, softly, as if greeting a familiar room. I did not move. The church breathed with me. And in that shared breath, the story held its next word on the tip of its tongue, ready to fall. The figure in the doorway kept the flashlight hooded, then slid it low along the baseboards like a tide. The beam skimmed across the seam where the compartment had once been, climbed the pipe with its flaking paint, and settled, at last, on the shelving where polish and altar cloths used to live. I recognized the gate before I recognized the face. It was the young pastor, the one whose sermons ran short and whose eyes met people without flinching. He stepped into the room and let the door rest almost closed behind him, the latch kissing but not catching. He did not startle when he saw me. He inclined his head the way country men did when they acknowledged company without turning it into a meeting. His free hand traced the mortar line, knuckles brushing dust, as if he tested the wall's memory for pain. It pressed here, he said, voice low, as though he spoke to the building first. Like a bruise. He unhooked the flashlight only enough to study the variations in color where new brick once met old. They told me churches kept secrets because people put their hardest truths here, he said. I did not understand that sometimes the building helped. He lifted a cardboard box from the shelf, the kind that came from office supply stores, the lid softened at the corners by handling. He set it on the table that parishioners used for coffee urns. Inside lay a spill of keys, the old kind with teeth like small, careful lightning. Some had tags with numbers in pencil. Some had scraps of ribbon tied at the bow. He turned one in his fingers and then placed it back as if the metal itself asked to be treated like a relic. These came from behind the sacristy cabinet we removed last month, he said. The cabinet did not sit flush. Someone had slipped a thin board behind it to tilt it away from the wall. The keys were in that gap, 33 of them. He looked past me toward the stairs. Only 3 should have existed in 1986. A key caught the light, its bow worn oval by a thumb, its shaft thinner than the rest. The pastor held it to the wall where the compartment had been, and though the gesture had nothing to do with mechanics, the outline looked, for a second, like an answer pressed against a question. He left me with the keys and the sound of his steps ascending. Alone again, I took notes the way a person drank water after a long desert, steadily, but with an ache that rose from the hollow places. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. Her car was found parked behind the rectory, her hymnal book still on the passenger seat, and the church doors locked from inside. For decades, her case remained one of the state's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Parishioners whispered about what might have happened, but no one dared to suspect the man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years. Then, in 2023, during a renovation of the church basement, workers uncovered a sealed compartment behind a brick wall. Inside were personal belongings, a rosary, and a torn page from a hymnal marked with Anna's handwriting. Modern forensic testing revealed traces of DNA linking the evidence to Father Raymond Doyle, a now retired priest who had moved to a nearby town. The discovery shattered a community built on faith and trust, and exposed the darkness that had hidden beneath the altar for nearly 4 decades. I wrote the whole passage into my notebook again because the town required repetition the way a wound required changing the dressing, often, carefully, until air could do its work. The next morning, I tracked down a man named Dwyer, who had worked the church's tiny office in the 80s, affixing stamps with his tongue and balancing ledgers with a stub pencil. He lived in a second-story apartment above a barber shop and kept his tea bags on a windowsill like xylophone keys. From a shoebox he withdrew a memo Doyle had written in May 1986, 3 weeks after Anna vanished, authorizing the purchase of a security set for the parish grounds. The list included padlocks for the tool shed, a new deadbolt for the side sacristy door, and, oddly, a tin of graphite lubricant. The receipt bore Abbott Hardware's letterhead and a flourish of initials, RD. On the bottom in faint pencil, a clerk had written extra copy cut for rectory. Dwyer tapped the graphite line. He said old lock stuck, he told me. He said friction saved us from carelessness. I thought it sounded like a homily. I laughed. He spread his hands. I laughed. At the courthouse, a clerk brought me a stack of building permits that told a story the town had not realized it was telling. In the winter before Anna's disappearance, St. Matthew's had filed paperwork to reline the basement walls against damp and to remove the obsolete coal chute. The permit had been signed off without inspection, common enough in that era, but included a line noting work overseen by owner's representative. The name written there belonged to Doyle. The clerk ran a fingertip along the signature. Old inspections went by Trust, she said. Trust did most of the heavy lifting around here. I returned to the nursing home to see Mr. Cowell, the former janitor, and brought him a photograph of the basement wall taken just after the discovery. He adjusted his thick glasses and studied the mortar. He told me to finish smooth, he said. Said a neat wall made a clean room. He squinted at the color shift that remained visible even after the renovation workmen had cleaned the brick. He had a way of making a preference sound like a rule. He set the photo down. He wasn't unkind, he added, as if that mattered now. That's what confuses me when I try to lay the puzzle. He wasn't unkind in the ways we were taught to measure unkindness. The sheriff's new team built a calendar on a whiteboard in a room that had once been used for beginner ceramics. April 1986 marched across in squares, each box crowded with notes. Tuesday, choir practice. Wednesday, a leak reported in the basement bathroom. Thursday, Parish Finance Committee, adjourned at 9:05 p.m. Friday, fish fry. Saturday, wedding rehearsal cancelled because the groom's father suffered chest pains. Sunday, Palm Sunday sermon called Gates and Paths. The boxes filled and refilled as old memories added a word here, a shrug there, an apology for forgetting. On the day Anna vanished, someone wrote evening service, light rain. Someone else added doors locked, from inside. Under that, in a different hand, a third person wrote why. From the diocesan archive I borrowed Doyle's homily drafts for that spring. He kept them in long, sloping cursive with marginal notes that betrayed a mind that needed to feel words before speaking them. The draft for the week of Anna's disappearance circled a single theme: the comfort of order. He underlined it 3 times. He wrote, in the margin, locks and liturgy, it all holds. On the back, a grocery list in the same hand required yeast, candles, brads, and a trowel. Someone, likely Doyle himself, had folded the page along a neat diagonal and tucked it into a book of common prayers. I opened the book and a grit of dried mortar fell like a memory from the spine. Doyle remained in his bungalow while his lawyer filed motions and the diocese arranged statements. Across the street, a woman who had sung soprano in the 90s watered petunias and avoided looking toward his porch. She came to my rental one afternoon with a folder of photographs from parish picnics. I tried not to remember anything, she said, because remembering felt like gossip and I was raised to hate gossip. She laid down a photo of Doyle beside the dunk tank, sleeves rolled, grinning with a grin that had once meant summer. Behind him, out of focus, a young woman stood near the cotton candy machine. Her hair floated, then, in the wind off the river. Someone had written names on the back of the photo in ballpoint. The letters spelled A. Mitchell. In the county storage room, I found the original choir attendance sheets. Anna had placed checkmarks in a small disciplined hand. Through March her checks appeared uncluttered. In early April, the ink deepened, the lines pressed hard enough to make a shadow on the following page. On the last sheet, next to her name, the box remained blank. Underneath, a faint smear crossed the square as if a finger had hesitated there and then smudged the graphite of someone else's pencil. The page smelled, absurdly, like chalk and lemon oil. Lorraine and Walter kept meeting me on their porch because the inside of the house held too much of the past in its corners. He came to see us 2 days after she went missing, Walter said in that late light when the world held still for a few minutes and made honesty gently possible. He brought a ham from the butcher and a pie from O'Malley's and told us we should let ourselves be fed. Walter swallowed. He also took her hymnal from the kitchen counter, said he needed to make a photocopy of her notes for the choir. He brought it back the next afternoon and put it exactly where it had been. I thanked him for being so thorough. He shook his head once. I thanked him. The hymnal itself bore, on its inside front cover, a scuffed rectangle where a library card pocket had once been. I held the book up and angled it to the window and saw that the scuff had been covered, at some point, in a thin veil of paste that had dried too smooth for the textured cardstock around it. In the paste, near the edge, a half-moon of a fingerprint pressed shallow and, now, entirely useless. It looked like the impression of a snow boot left at sunset. It looked like a person stepping away. The young pastor unlocked a cupboard in the sacristy and showed me a shallow drawer I had not noticed before. Inside lay a roll of paper as old maps, the original architectural drawings for the 1923 renovation that had fashioned St. Matthew's into the shape locals knew. The drawings indicated the coal chute's angle, the original pantry walls, the pocket door behind the side chapel. The pocket door had been sealed long before the 80s, its track filled with debris and paint, but the drawing explained what the building had forgotten how to say. The side chapel led, once, to a small service hall that opened onto the alley behind the rectory, a passage that bypassed the main nave entirely. The door, when it slid closed, had locked with a key from the inside, a lock whose mechanism matched the thin, old-fashioned key a carpenter had found wedged under a joist. The pastor exhaled. Side door, he said, not as a question but as a name for something that had always been there and had refused to be seen. I sat in the chapel afterward and let the weight of that track in the wall settle into the map in my head. I imagined Anna stepping into the side chapel with her hymnal, tired and damp from the rain, perhaps summoned, perhaps simply shepherded by habit and trust. I imagined the door sliding with a low, wooden purr. I imagined the lock turned by a person who had turned thousands of locks and oiled hundreds of hinges in the name of care. I imagined silence folding itself over a small room like a cloak. A retired deacon, brought back to walk the spaces with the sheriff, paused by the vestment closet and then knelt without ceremony to touch the floor. He told me not to worry about the squeak here, the deacon said. He said he'd fixed it. The deacon pressed down with his palm and the board gave only slightly, quiet. He liked things that didn't speak when they shouldn't. The deacon stood with a wince and looked at the altar with an expression I could not name. Reverence and rage shared the same bone structure. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. Her blue Oldsmobile sat behind the rectory, her hymnal rested on the passenger seat, and the church doors were locked from inside. For decades, the case persisted like a cold star above the town. Parishioners whispered, but their whispers curved around the name of the man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years. Then, in 2023, during a renovation, workers found a sealed compartment behind a brick wall in the church basement. It held a rosary, a compact, a matchbook, and a torn hymn page bearing her name. Modern forensic testing tied what lay inside to Father Raymond Doyle, retired now, living quietly under a trimmed hedge. The discovery did not solve grief. It did not straighten time. It did, however, make the invisible visible long enough for a town to see what had lived under its feet. The sheriff's office contacted a locksmith who specialized in pre-war mechanisms, a man with hands that looked like they had always held small, stubborn things. He disassembled the lock on the side chapel's old pocket door with the patience of a monk and set the pieces in a velvet-lined tray like bones for teaching. Inside the cylinder lay a fragment of metal that did not belong, a shaped sliver that acted as a false pin, allowing the lock to receive a key from either side if one knew how to tickle it. The locksmith held the sliver up with tweezers, eyebrows lifted. "Someone wanted this door to behave against its nature," he said. "Someone wanted inside and outside to feel the same." I took the sliver to Abbott at the hardware store, and he whistled low. He fetched a little binder of notes he kept for odd requests, items rare enough that he wrote them down to remember how he had satisfied a customer. In April 1986, a man had asked for a small file for brass and a tube of powdered graphite. Abbott could not swear the man had been Doyle, but the purchase matched the memo and the memory. "He paid in cash," Abbott said. He held out exact change like it mattered. I spent mornings with Mrs. Reinhold, who told me stories about Anna that had nothing to do with mysteries and everything to do with a person's daily kindness. Anna had shoveled her walkway and then shoveled her neighbor's without being asked. She had taught a child to hold a harmony by resting a hand on the child's shoulder until the body learned to hear itself. She had picked up a fallen missal and straightened its pages so the next person would not have to crease them back. She had left pennies on the rail near the votive candles for people who forgot to bring change. She made the world feel tidier, Mrs. Reinhold said, without making anyone feel judged. Then the old woman pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and said, "He told us to trust him. He told us God loved order." I thought that meant safety. I did not know it could mean control. In the evenings, the choir rehearsed and the town's breathing steadied. The young pastor kept the doors open. Children ran in the aisles before the adults fussed, then laughed, then let them run. The organist relearned a Bach prelude he had loved as a boy and played it too fast before remembering how the piece asked to be paced. In the pauses between songs, the building clicked and sighed, shedding a little of the weight it had carried in silence. Jean's voice, worn but stubborn, rose and threaded through the others like a piece of bright yarn in a muted weave. A letter surfaced, then, crisp and overdue, postmarked June 1986 but never delivered. It had slipped behind the mail slot at the rectory and remained, stuck by dust and paint, until the young pastor's curiosity pried up the wooden pocket and released the caught paper like a leaf from an old book. The letter had been addressed to Anna's parents. The handwriting belonged to Doyle. In it, he wrote about mysteries and patience and the tempering of grief by ritual. He included, folded inside, a photocopy of a hymn text, "Lead, kindly light." In the margin of the photocopy, in a hand that looked almost like Anna's but heavier, a tiny note said, "Ask him about the side door." Lorraine held the letter in her lap and read that line over and over until the words lost their shape and turned to sound. I visited Doyle's bungalow again and watched the curtains move as though a person had just stepped away. The bluebird feeder swayed though the air lay still. A dog barked 2 houses down and broke the quiet into pieces. Doyle's lawyer declined an interview. That was accurate. It was also an answer that tried to make itself more noble than it was. I sat on the curb and wrote the names of the hymns in a column and the names of the doors in another and drew lines between them the way a child mapped constellations the first time someone handed over the pen. I dreamed of the basement that night, though I told no one because dreams felt like gossip and I had come to hate gossip the way the soprano had been trained to. In the dream, the wall and the seam and the keys and the pipe arranged themselves into a shape that did not exist in waking. The shape was a face, but not a person's. It was the building's face, the expression of a place asked to hold too much. I woke before dawn, my chest tight, and walked to St. Matthew's in the kind of pre-morning where the world felt caught between versions. The church had left its side door open. The first light laid itself across the pews the way a shawl lay across a back. I sat where Anna's parents always sat and said nothing because nothing respectful came. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell had disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. Her car was behind the rectory. Her hymnal was on the passenger seat. The doors were locked from the inside. For decades, the mystery sat like a stone in the town's mouth. In 2023, a sealed compartment opened and said a name. The young pastor entered from the sacristy with the sleepy, bright-eyed look of a person who prayed before coffee. He did not ask me to leave. He put on the kettle in the basement kitchen and brought up 2 mugs that did not match. He set them on the rail and leaned both elbows on the wood where 1,000 elbows had leaned. I found something else, he said, not dramatically, not with triumph. He pulled from his pocket a small brass ring with 2 teeth. It lay under the step at the side door. It caught the light when I kneeled to scrape wax. It looked, for an instant, like a piece of the sun. He turned it and it clicked softly against itself. It belonged to the inside lock. He placed it on the rail and pushed it toward me. It had been filed to a thinness that made me want to warm it in my hands. In the deacon's old notes, there was a line that had seemed, for months, like nothing more than grief. He knew the building better than anyone. He told it when to breathe. I read it again, now, and it became something harder. Control often hid inside care. Authority often dressed itself in service. The town had not been foolish. It had been taught. The sheriff held a press conference in the school gym because the church felt wrong for it. The floor smelled like polish and rubber soles. People brought folding chairs from home and insisted on using them because they hated sitting where their children played basketball. He spoke plainly about what the lab had confirmed and what had not been proven. He did not say, "We solved it." He said, "We opened it." He asked for patience and he acknowledged that patience had already been asked for too often and too long. He said Anna's name 3 times. He did not say Doyle's title. He said Raymond Doyle. The name sat on the gym's air until the air learned how to hold them. I walked the churchyard afterward and paused where the lilacs grew thick along the rectory. Their scent in June pressed down like a hand on the crown of the head. The alley held a breath of the cool that never left shaded brick. Somewhere a screen door slapped. Somewhere a radio carried a ball game in a voice that sounded like summer had always sounded. I could almost see Anna cutting across the yard with her hymnal tucked under her arm, rain freckling her hair. I could almost hear a door close softly in a way that told a person nothing because soft did not mean safe. That evening the choir sang "Lead, Kindly Light" without being asked, and voices broke on the word gloom and then mended themselves in time for home. The young pastor left the side door propped with a wedge of cedar and stood near it with his hands in his pockets like a man at the edge of a dock watching the lake breathe. Jean reached the hymn's last line and held it 1 heartbeat too long because endings had been taken from this story and she had learned to claim them where she could. The building vibrated the way a struck bull vibrated, then quieted, then held. The sheriff called me the next morning before coffee and asked me to come to the church. His voice did not carry urgency, only a heaviness that made words feel like they wore boots. In the basement, beside the seam, he pointed to a hairline crack that had spidered across 3 bricks since the compartment had been opened. It did not threaten the wall. It did not reveal a new cache of objects. It simply existed where no one had noticed it before. He touched it with his fingertip and then took his hand away like a person careful not to antler a small wound into a larger one. Buildings age, he said. Stress finds its paths. He looked at me. So do stories. He did not tell me what to write. He did not need to. I sat on the bottom step of the basement stairs and wrote the town's name and the church's name and the names of the people who had sung in that room for decades while secrets lived under them like a second foundation. I wrote Anna's name and then wrote it again because names said twice became stronger in the mouth. I wrote Doyle's name because leaving it out felt like painting over a crack and calling the wall mended. I wrote the detail about the keys, the trowel, the graphite, the sliver in the lock. I wrote that in April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town, her car found behind the rectory, her hymnal on the passenger seat, and the doors locked from inside, that for decades her case remained among the state's most haunting mysteries and people refused to suspect the man who had led every Sunday sermon, that in 2023 a sealed compartment in the church basement yielded a rosary, a compact, a matchbook, and a torn hymn page marked with her hand, that modern forensic testing tied those objects to Father Raymond Doyle, retired now but not absolved by time. I wrote the line about how the discovery broke not only the silence but the habits of deference that had kept the silence well fed. Upstairs the morning light shifted across the pews and painted one aisle bright while leaving the other in a soft, bearable dusk. The young pastor knelt and stood and knelt again, hands flat on his thighs, the motion spare and unadorned. Jean hung the robes on their pegs and smoothed the shoulders as if readying old friends for a photograph. Lorraine brought a small vase of daisies and set it on the rail where hundreds of hands had worn the lacquer thin. Walter came late and sat where he always sat and stared not at the altar but at the side chapel door, closed now, its pocket visible as a paler stripe of paint. The building held them without explanation. The air carried the smell of wax and old wood and rain pressed out of stone by heat. The choir began, and the first note rose pure enough to steady a town. The next days moved like a slow procession, each hour carrying its own small candle. The sheriff's whiteboard filled and refilled, arrows crossing arrows until the lines looked like hymn staves without notes. I sat through afternoons at St. Matthew's when the sun slanted through stained glass and scattered fragments of color onto the floor that did not match the colors in anyone's memory. People kept bringing me fragments that did not sing alone. A former altar boy named Peter said he had stayed late on the night of a finance committee meeting in April 1986 to help carry ledger books. He remembered Father Raymond Doyle telling him not to use the side chapel because it was drafty, and then, moments later, he had watched the priest slide that very pocket door closed with 2 fingers and a practiced economy. Peter had thought it elegant, a magician's smoothness applied to wood. Now the memory felt like a weight pressed into his palm. A retired choir librarian named Ruth pulled a map from a metal tube in her attic, a hand-drawn diagram of seating assignments for the spring of 1986, with initials penciled into pews and asterisks beside the names of people whose voices needed gentle support. Beside AM she had written, strong, steady, remind to breathe. On the bottom margin, in pencil darker than the rest, another hand had written, side door creaks, rectify. The handwriting matched the curve and insistence of Doyle's grocery lists. Ruth had never noticed the note. The diagram had lived in the attic's dim heat, slowly turning brittle and truthful. I drove to the diner 30 miles north, where the matchbook design had been born, then died, then resurrected in a framed photo above the register. The counter smelled of coffee old enough to vote. Behind the glass, a stack of lemon meringue pies huddled like weather. The owner's daughter, who had been a waitress in the 80s, told me a priest used to stop on Thursdays for black coffee and a grilled cheese, the simplest order a person could make and still pretend they had eaten. He carried a small paper bag sometimes, folded tight at the top. He wrote sermon notes on napkins and left them crumpled, as if words shed like skins. She said he had gentle hands that placed money on the counter as though it might crack. And one evening in April 1986, he had handed her a stack of matchbooks and said, with a smile that never reached his eyes, "We're doing a parish fish fry." I'll make sure folks know where to stop when they drive north. When I returned to town, the air smelled of cut grass and coming rain. The young pastor met me on the church steps with a brown envelope that had arrived with no return address and a shaky hand on the front, "To whoever needs this." Inside lay a strip of 8mm film coiled like a sleeping snake. He had already arranged for the high school AV club to digitize it, and that evening we watched, in a classroom that still carried chalk in its bones, the bright tremble of a parish picnic from June 1986. The camera wandered through faces like a person moving through a dream. Children ran, then looped back to run again. Adults held paper plates and smiled in the particular way people smile when they are conscious of a lens. The frame jostled, steadied, then settled on the dunk tank. The priest, young then by comparison, sleeves rolled, fell backward into the water and surfaced with a grin people thought they knew. In the corner of the frame, half obscured by a flapping banner, a young woman with chestnut hair hovered near the cotton candy machine, tugging a ribbon from her wrist. Someone beside her leaned in and spoke, her face turned toward the camera for a single, accidental second. The mouth, familiar. The eyes, steady. The legend A. Mitchell written on the back of the photo at Abbott's store didn't lie. The film froze that instant and held it up to a town that had taught itself to forget shapes. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. Her car was found behind the rectory, her hymnal book still on the passenger seat, and the church doors locked from inside. For decades, her case remained one of the state's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Parishioners whispered about what might have happened, but no one dared to suspect the man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years. Then, in 2023, during a renovation of the church basement, workers uncovered a sealed compartment behind a brick wall. Inside were personal belongings, a rosary, and a torn page from a hymnal marked with Anna's handwriting. Modern forensic testing revealed traces of DNA linking the evidence to Father Raymond Doyle, a now retired priest who had moved to a nearby town. The discovery shattered a community built on faith and trust, and exposed the darkness that had hidden beneath the altar for nearly 4 decades. I wrote the passage out again, whispering the words under my breath as if keeping tempo for a choir that needed a firm hand. The sheriff brought in a structural engineer to read the building's body like a physician. She walked the basement with a penlight and tapped where stone sounded hollow and where it answered with a full chest. At the seam where the compartment had been, she set a small level and watched the bubble shiver. "This section was trued after construction," she said. "Different recipe in the mortar. Likely done in a hurry by someone who knew how to make hastiness look like care." She pointed to scuff marks along the floor near the shelving. "These are small and shallow, like something heavy had been moved aside and then put back exactly." She crouched, touched the scuff with 2 fingers, and lifted brick dust the color of old loaves. "There's a ritual to this," she said. "Ritual often hides control." A box from the diocesan archive arrived at the sheriff's office under the label Pastoral Counseling Logs, 1983 to 1986. The logs were not transcripts, they were lists of appointments and vague notations: initials, AM, hymn discussion, 7:15 p.m. AM, scheduling conflict, 8 p.m. AM, side chapel, 8:30 p.m. The same night recurred, the week before Anna vanished. The hour slotted neatly between choir practice and lockup. The handwriting belonged to a secretary long dead, but the initials and places carried their own ache. The sheriff stared at those lines a long time, then drew his pen through the air, connecting dates and places as if the ink could make a path through years. I visited the rectory and stood in the side chapel where the pocket door once slid, where it had once locked from inside with a key that fit both ways because someone had taught it to. The young pastor had left the track exposed, the paint shaved back respectfully, the mechanism visible like a bone in an anatomy lesson. In the chapel's quiet, the building hummed at a frequency that was not sound so much as presence. I traced the line where wall met frame, paused where scratches suggested a hand had fumbled in a hurry years ago. I thought of a person taking slow breaths and telling themselves the order of things would hold. Jean sat with me afterward in a pew and told me about a rehearsal 2 weeks before Anna vanished when the electricity flickered and failed, and the choir finished the hymn in dimness, voices steadier than their hands. He loved those moments, she said, meaning Doyle. He would say, "Now we hear what we really sound like." She picked at a loose thread on her coat. I used to find that comforting. Now I wonder if he liked the dark because he decided who was lit. Lorraine brought out a shoebox of objects that had survived the way only small, stubborn things do: ticket stubs, a ribbon from a county fair, a Polaroid of Anna with her arm around a classmate's shoulders, their eyes squeezed tight with laughter. At the bottom lay a church bulletin from the night of the disappearance. The readings were circled. A line in the announcements section had been underlined twice: "Please use the side entrance this evening due to maintenance near the vestibule." Lorraine had never noticed the underline. She had not understood, then, that maintenance could be another word for arrangement. In the bungalow, a shade remained half-lowered. The bluebird feeder swayed. A neighbor said she had watched Doyle develop a habit, these past months, of pacing the length of his small living room with a book in his hand, stopping to read a line, then walking again, as if measuring the shape of sentences against the shape of a room. He no longer worked in the garden. He no longer waved. He had become a figure framed by glass, a presence reduced to an outline. The locksmith and the engineer and the sheriff stood together in the basement one afternoon, 3 disciplines listening for the same confession in different languages. The locksmith said the door could have been closed from either side if the false pin were engaged. The engineer said the seam could have been set in hours, not days, if the workman had skill, especially if he had help moving the shelf. The sheriff said help would likely have been trust, a person allowed to touch what others could not. Each statement hung in the air like a note, and together they made a chord the building seemed to recognize. In April 1986, 24-year-old choir singer Anna Mitchell disappeared after evening service at St. Matthew's Church in a quiet Illinois town. Her car was found behind the rectory, her hymnal book still on the passenger seat, and the church doors locked from inside. For decades, her case remained one of the state's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Parishioners whispered about what might have happened, but no one dared to suspect the man who had led every Sunday sermon for 30 years. Then, in 2023, during a renovation of the church basement, workers uncovered a sealed compartment behind a brick wall. Inside were personal belongings, a rosary, and a torn page from a hymnal marked with Anna's handwriting. Modern forensic testing revealed traces of DNA linking the evidence to Father Raymond Doyle, a now retired priest who had moved to a nearby town. The discovery shattered a community built on faith and trust, and exposed the darkness that had hidden beneath the altar for nearly 4 decades. I kept that paragraph alive in my notebook like a candle that refused to gutter. A new witness arrived as the light failed, an organ tuner named Lyle, who had serviced St. Matthew's pipes for years. He carried a small leather case and smelled faintly of machine oil and mint. He said that in the spring of 1986, Doyle had asked him to come after hours because the instrument spoke truest in the evening. Lyle had tuned on the balcony while the church lay dim below. He had heard voices in the side chapel, one even and low, one answering in bursts, then quiet. He had recognized the even voice as the priest's, the other could have been anyone, but the rhythm reminded him of someone thinking while she spoke. "I came downstairs for a glass of water," he said, and he met me halfway. Told me to finish up and lock the balcony when I left. I remember thinking, who leaves first in a church? The music or the priest? The young pastor began leaving the church open longer in the evenings. People came and sat without words. Some prayed. Some stared at the pocket track and the smartened seam. Some traced the carved edges of the pews with their fingertips as if reading Braille they could not decipher. A child asked his grandmother if the building was sad. She said buildings did not feel. Then she looked up at the rafters, at the way the beams crossed like held hands, and amended, "It remembers." On a Saturday, the choir organized a community sing that stretched into twilight. They chose hymns that everyone knew without looking. They sang too loudly here, too softly there, corrected, laughed, and began again. Between songs the pastor read short passages from old bulletins that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with living: bake sale notices, lost and found lists, thanks for donated paint. People made a point of placing items on the rail: a picture, a prayer, a penny, small acts of claiming the space back. Lorraine placed the photocopied him text from the undelivered letter. The margin note asked him about the side door, visible to anyone who passed. Walter stood beside her, his hand resting on the rail with a deliberate calm, as if he were teaching his body to recognize the church as a place that held him, not a place that held him down. That night, rain moved in again, soft and patient, the kind that taught houses where they had hairline flaws. The church breathed it in and out. In the basement, one of the new bricks shed a line of damp along its middle, a dark smile that faded as the air dried. The sheriff ran a fingertip along it and found nothing but the ordinary grit of old walls